welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. Obviously, as COVID hit, we kind of put some of our longstanding workforce development issues on the back burner. And this is an indication of how important we still think it is as we come out of COVID, hopefully sooner than later. There is no question that we're going to revisit the same sort of struggle that we had in 2019. And so therefore, we continue to work with the Be Bold effort, Jim and Ken and Wood, to make sure that we're prepared, to make sure that people aren't taking the whole issue lightly. And so what you're going to hear today is some creative solutions, and hopefully we'll have a bit of a dialogue as well. So thank you once again, everybody, for joining us, and I'm going to ask Jim Wood to take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Paul. First of all, let me thank MadREP and Paul and Jean for all the work and the help that they've given, not just on this event, but over the years to the issue, and not just these issues. So I appreciate it very much. I also appreciate everybody who signed on for today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Just a quick bit of context. We send everybody a link to a video that would give you background on the research that we've done in terms of the marketplace and some other bits and pieces, and left that off with the assertion that, that we had identified revenue streams and some mechanisms that we thought produced a new opportunity for the state in terms of funding a more efficient, effective, and sustainable recruitment strategy, recruitment and retention strategy. I want to take the next 3 or 4 or 5 minutes and play a video for you that picks up from that assertion. You're going to be looking at video that we edited out of a presentation of the Wisconsin Counties Association earlier this year. So it's a little choppy, but it's got the information. We brought 5 criteria to that search. We said all of these things need to be linked directly to the filling of high demand jobs in Wisconsin. They need to be fiscally responsible, financially sustainable, and contractually secure. They need to strengthen state and local tax bases. They need to generate a net gain in public and private revenues. And they need to come from both public and private revenues generated as a result of filling high demand jobs. We worked then with Deloitte to identify 3 high demand jobs in the state of Wisconsin. We identified 3 that were prevalent in terms of our travels around the state of Wisconsin: nurses, welders, and software contractors and developers. And we asked Deloitte to go out and to identify how much money, new private revenue and new public revenue, would be generated as you filled a job. And so here's the associate degree nurse, annual wage starting at $57,396. That position, when you fill that nurse position, on average in the state, it produces $8,800+ of new public annual revenue induced. But it also produces new private annual revenues, and that comes in 2 categories. Additional income profit generated for the company as a result of or for the employer as a result of that hire, of that filling of that job, and an impact on retention, training and retention costs. So the nurse generates $40,000 a year over and above her or his salary. Here it is for the welder, and the number there is $34,000, and the IT worker. And again, if you take a look at this, you're looking at a $44,000 a year. So then the question is, okay, what are we talking about here? And I won't bore you with all the bits and pieces on here, other than to underscore that we see this as a collaborative effort, and the job as we see it is to place and keep a human being in a job that works for that person, the employer, the community, and the state. We have concluded, based on the research done by Deloitte and other conversations, that the number we should be looking at is a not to exceed $20,000 amortized over a 5-year period of time, split between a public contribution or investment and a private, so 10 grand a piece. So let's take the 5-year, what you're looking at in this green column is this is the return on investment net over a 5-year period of time. Net, it is after the $20,000 has been invested, okay? So you take that and then you say, well, how many job openings were there in 2018? We just took the numbers for new growth and for exits, okay? And you can see what those numbers are. And the net over a 5-year period of time is in excess of $500 million, okay? Now that's all source that I showed you, but it's $500 million. The question was, is there a revenue stream that could be developed that would work here? And we think the answer to that question is yes. What all of that took us to was that you've got two major kinds of populations. You've got people who are ready to work, okay? And in order to be able to mechanize and monetize that process, we believe you have to create something we're using as a working title called Wisconsin Workforce Recruitment and Retention Management Fund. Every single hire turns into an investment opportunity to be overseen by this retention management fund. I, as an employer, would say, okay, you're going to have to sign a contract. I'm going to sign a contract. I sign it. I'm good for the 10 grand. Okay, you're going to sign it. You have to stay here for 5 years and whatever other clawbacks need to go in the contract. We send that down to Madison. Madison takes a look at it. At the Revenue Department, they verify that we projected the tax payments that this person's going to make over the next 5 years accurately, okay? And then we're only using with the direct. We're not using any of the indirect or induced, only direct. And as soon as they sign off it, then it goes to the investment fund. And if they say, okay, it's cleared all away, you are good to go, okay? The second category are people ready to learn. And this is about building our labor pipeline. And in this case, we're looking at a bond mechanism and again, a third mechanism that we think is worth looking at, and that is community and regional economic development foundations, and there are models like that around the country, but again, time does not permit. So we're in this highly competitive market, but we're looking at a world where we get to say that it is possible to generate the revenues Wisconsin needs to fund a competitive workforce recruitment and retention effort and create new public and private revenues without raising existing taxes. I am happy, Kenan's happy to take any questions or comments you have about that. And then we want to move into the question of where we are now. Part of what we're trying to do is to create a statewide digital platform that enables decision makers to hear what workforce shortages mean. Okay, because when we talk about workforce shortages, we're not just talking about workforce shortages, we're talking about tax-based shortages, we're talking about education shortages, we're talking about infrastructure shortages, because when you don't fill jobs, people don't pay taxes. And so it is a large issue, we think. We believe, as Gene has suggested, as Paul has suggested, that these issues didn't go away because of the pandemic. What's happening is they are changing a little bit, but they are being exacerbated by the pandemic. And consequently, over the next, we believe, 12 to 18 months, it is going to become more complicated, not less complicated. That said, we also think that there's some opportunities in there. So I'd like to start by asking you to talk about what you were seeing before the pandemic swept in terms of workforce recruitment and shortages, okay? What you think you're seeing now and what you expect to be seeing 6 months out, a year out.
So, hi, this is Julie Olick from UW Health. I'll just answer the question. We had regularly between 800 and 1,000 vacancies posted before COVID. And we had areas where we were having trouble recruiting, as I think is true for all major healthcare providers in Wisconsin. And current state, we're still recruiting for a lot of those challenging positions. I mean, as I'm sure most of you know, we went through a period where we were prepared for a COVID surge. Our hospital was nearly empty. We've had people furloughed. But as our hospital is now full and our outpatient facilities are nearly back to normal, we're hiring again, and we never stopped hiring. So if you go on our website, we still have a lot of our critical positions out there, but also everything from electricians to, maintenance workers. So we're very much still in the market for employees, and we don't have as many openings as we had in January, but we certainly are still filling critical positions.
Jim, I think that what we see is the match problem that existed in 2018 and 19 in terms of available workforce versus available positions is only going to be exacerbated as we come through COVID. In other words, we've got double-digit unemployment, so there's an assumption that, wow, we've got this whole new talent pool that's available for all those jobs, similar to what Julie just talked about. But in fact, it's a pool of people whose skills may not be right for the kinds of openings that exist, and it's also a pool that may still be waiting for their recall to their old position. And I think maybe Seth and Caleb could probably expound on that a little bit, but I think ultimately we're going to have a little higher unemployment, but the match issue is going to be critical.
From what we're seeing a little bit there, to Paul's point, we definitely saw we were running into a workforce shortage on skilled and prepared labor. Now in the current environment, I think that what we're running into is there are still companies who have continued to have employment needs and have continued to hire. Some have capitalized on some of the layoffs and furloughs for some of the workers. But also, I think one of the factors that is complicating our crystal ball right now a little bit is with the federal subsidy to the unemployment. There are some folks who right now are taking advantage of the time to take some time off and not necessarily financially feel the full impact of being on a furlough or a layoff and are hoping to go back. But I think that as we're seeing more of the furloughs turn into permanent closures, and as the federal unemployment subsidy will come to an end in July, I think that will give us a better sense of what our true scale is. And then I think we're going to also see an increase in employment pursuits and people connecting back to needing to work again. But I still think that we're going to run into some skill gaps, and especially when it comes to I'll say digital literacy or preparedness. I think that's kind of been highlighted in a couple of our examples. So I think that's going to continue to be an issue for us to increase people's digital literacy to be able to work and learn in different fashions, because not everybody was prepared to make that transition.
But I'll just dovetail what Seth had mentioned. Part of the other piece of this too, and hopefully it's just an aberration, but this last week we actually saw an increase in initial claims for the first time in a long time, like 23,000 to 29,000 unofficial numbers. So we're watching, and then Dennis is on the call, I see. So we're watching those pretty closely. In addition to increased prevalence of COVID these days, and watching how that could possibly affect re-entry into the employment market. And I know WEDC's report just came out yesterday, and it's an excellent. I saw Barb was reading it last night, so that was great. I think a lot of us were diving in and digging through, but we're watching the COVID piece very closely because one of the strongest indicators of when we can be back to normal is when that pandemic is back under control. So watching that really closely. And then the other piece I wanted to touch on was, from our side, the programs that we're using, we're still seeing really strong utilization of programs like apprenticeship. Wisconsin Fast Forward this time around had more applications than we had dollars. And so people are still, at least in April and May and June, investing in workforce training But for all the reasons that folks have mentioned thus far, we're going to continue to monitor that pretty closely.
The technical college perspective, at least our technical college, I can tell you we're sort of trapped a little bit. So we have to complete all the students that didn't complete in spring where they need to have actual hands-on labs, but we have to do it in a very safe way. We're trying to schedule fall classes and also do that in a safe way, which means you have lower numbers in your actual sections. And then we also are the rapid response provider for our workforce development board, and that has exploded right now. So we're trying to assist the individuals being laid off in those companies, as well as trying to keep our students moving forward and opening places for those that need to update their skills to get training. So it's a bit of all hands on deck right now, trying to meet all those needs at one time.
So, I mean, I find all of this helpful, and let me try and make some linkages here. We have been saying for the past year that there's lots and lots of good stuff going on in Wisconsin when it comes to workforce development and recruitment and retention, but that it is not sufficient to the challenge. That we have to figure out some way to get stronger and more sustainable, et cetera, and try to figure out how to fund things. One of the things that I think that has occurred as a result of the COVID thing is that it may have added to a population, as all three of our last speakers are suggesting, an unexpected expansion of the people who may be interested and available for education and training. Right? And so the premise there is the population that got hit, as you all know, hardest by COVID, not just here, but across the country, is in leisure and tourism and the travel areas, et cetera. If those folks are available to us now and waiting for the unemployment bump to run out, the question is, what are we doing to be able to take care of those people, to funnel them into a training process, whether it's fast forward or it's something else, or it's the technical colleges, the UW system. The two questions. One is, how do we get them in? How do we move them quickly through the process so that they become available? But the other question again is, how do you pay for it? And one of the reasons that we think it's urgent to be moving the Be Bold stuff forward on this is that we think that there's an answer there in how we do that. The other piece that I put on the table for you to think about is that we see as a recruitment exercise the importance of the pipeline, the workforce pipeline bonding exercise, as a way of encouraging students to come into Wisconsin for training and education in exchange for commitments to stay here. We're doing that around the state in what I think are good programs. We think it needs to be energized and built up some more. So we think that's a piece that is pretty critical. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about is that as the COVID debate about how we open the economy and contain the disease continues, my take on it is that we're not going to close the economy down. Okay? That what will happen is there will be an increased focus on protecting the vulnerable, which means people with conflicted with health issues, et cetera. As that takes place, there will be the need for in-home care, the need for upgrading staffing at long-term medical care facilities. All of those things are going to produce an expanded demand in that area. And again, that's a different challenge in the rural areas than it is in the urban areas. And so that's another one of those things that I think we need to be thinking about. So let me, again, I want to open it up for anybody to comment. Dan, maybe you could, Dan Smith, maybe you could chime in with a little bit of your take on what's going on at least on the agricultural front.
Thank you, Jim. So, our agricultural sector was facing serious challenges for the last 5 or 6 years. And just when it seemed that rightly or wrongly, they felt that they were starting to rebuild a little bit, COVID came along. It has really set things back, but it's very, very similar to other issues that we've had in the past, whether it's been a natural disaster such as a drought or excessive flooding or something like that, or it's been interruption of trade negotiations or trade agreements. What it basically does is further the consolidation and specialization in agriculture, because those with the resources and the ability to survive the disruption take on the assets and the management of the other areas of those who exit the industry. And I think we're going to see that in the coming couple of years, and I think we have to be prepared for that. Many of the issues that we face in rural Wisconsin, the rural Midwest right now, I feel have been brought about by the consolidation, the specialization, vertical integration in agriculture. Because each time that happens, we rely less on people, we rely less on communities. We turn everything over to those who have the greatest assets, who can utilize the machinery, the technology to provide more and more of our food. And we haven't really replaced that cultural or the population on a rural basis. And what we have is obvious to all of us. We have empty communities, empty storefronts, empty schools. And until we can figure out a way to reverse that trend, we're going to have more of the same. I'm not sure that agriculture can provide the basis for the rural economy in the future that it has in the past. I think it's just going to continue to consolidate. You know, when you look at 40 years ago, we had 47,000 dairy farmers in the state of Wisconsin. You think of all those families shopping and going to the schools and being part of communities. And we went from 47,000 to 7,000 in 40 years. That 7,000 remaining dairy farm families cannot support an entire economic, social, and cultural environment that 47,000 once did. So really looking at, okay, where do we pivot to? You know, we all learn about the need to pivot at some point. And I think our rural communities are at a point now to look at these things, exactly the same things that we've all been talking about this morning. Where do we pivot? Because I'm not sure we can't go back to the agriculture of the past, and the agriculture of the future isn't going to address these types of situations. So, you know, healthcare, education, social services in the rural areas, rebuilding the infrastructure, and then looking at agriculture as part of a whole food system that goes from the ground all the way through distribution, processing, how that can be integrated into our food system. I think those are the things that we really need to be looking at, and that's why I really like working with Jim and Kenyon on these things, because I know that is how they see it too. They see it more holistically and more a part of a whole system than just relying on one particular industry.
Hi, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Just a couple of comments and observations. In our region, we have 4 technical colleges, and what we're seeing is an uptick in increased enrollment in nursing and in IT. So I think it kind of followed 9/11, where we had this uptick in firefighting and emergency services because people want to be part of the solution. What we don't know is, are these individuals that are currently gainfully employed and just see this as maybe more stable unemployment or employment going further, or is it really our underemployed or unemployed that are, you know, looking to receive these degrees? So we need to do more research in that regard. Clearly, I think all of our regions are putting more emphasis on the unemployed and the underemployed, and, you know, how do we make that happen? And in our talent hub, we've identified this as a priority. And sometimes, in order to get traction, you need to take a look at a use case. So right now, you might have seen the announcement yesterday with Microsoft. And we all know Microsoft owns LinkedIn. So they're opening up their LinkedIn learning platform to be able to take people through training and get them a skilled certificate that hopefully will help them be more employable. We're working with Michelle Schuler with Microsoft in our region. And so that use case that I talked about, Spectrum, right? Spectrum is looking at hiring 200 people in out of their Appleton office. So we're in conversations with them to say, can we work with our 2 workforce development boards, identify people right now that are currently, they have been displaced because of COVID, And Caleb, your team's been great. We've been working with Jim and Anthony with the workforce development boards. And then, so we get this punch list of individuals, we surround them with caseworkers, we work with Spectrum to make sure they're in a position to be able to provide the technology, because that's what they do as a company. And so these individuals can learn remotely. Hopefully they can gain employment and they can continue to work remotely. And use Microsoft's platform to see whether or not this is something that could be replicated across the state as we have these major hiring events, and trying to match the need of a company with a population that, you know, is desperate for upskilling and gainful employment. That's one. Number two is, as we will look at K-12, and Paul, you know, within Brittany is on the Regional Leadership Council. We've been pushing Inspire for a long time. That's a platform that connects employers with students with career opportunities, so they don't have to leave rural parts of our state. They know they can get gainful employment. And in that, because of COVID, it opened up an opportunity where in our region, 3,000 virtual student and employer job shadowing experiences incurred. And everything had to happen more immediate because the students didn't have the ability to go to a company, and schools were closed. So I don't disagree with anything that you said. I think in order to get traction, we need to take a look at real examples of where we can help identify the needs in our local communities to these opportunities.
So Julie Ollett from UW Health. I appreciate everything everyone has just said, and clearly the matching work and helping people get their skills to where they need to go is an issue that we at UW Health really appreciate and support. My comment actually goes back to something Jim was mentioning about hospitality workers, because we've really been thinking about not just our long run, but the short run of what we need for our employees to be able to come back to work. So we have essential workers who are not, a lot of them, able to work from home. And for those who are, as we look at K through 12 system, likely to come back at 50% and having kids home, supposed to be virtual learning 50%, a lot of our parents cannot sustain that any longer. And so I'm hearing from colleagues and from our human resources department, what do we do to support virtual learning at home for 50% of the time, probably for K through 12, when parents either are not at home to do it or can no longer sustain that. And it's really made us wonder about other parts of the workforce that are in short-term displacement situations, like hospitality. And is there a way to match them with children who need support with their virtual learning when school starts? And we realize that some parents are going to be able to pay for that and some parents aren't. And there's also the issue of having one more person in your bubble, potentially exposing your family to COVID. But I'm just hearing more and more that there's a real challenge with the fall coming, where people were counting on school being back in session. It's not going to be school as usual. And is there a way that very rapidly can we pivot to help match kids who need to learn with adults who can help them learn in a way that is safe in the context of the pandemic? And of course, figuring out a way to pay for it, not a small thing. And I'll just add quickly, we saw the open market work pretty well in terms of childcare for COVID with healthcare workers. But I'm not sure that with virtual learning, it's going to be the same thing, because no one really has that skill set, including parents, based on what I've been hearing, to help children learn in that environment. So that's been a big issue at UW Health, and I just wanted to put that on the table this morning.
Julie, I really appreciate what you just said. I think we're grappling with that here. So I am the director of Grow North Regional Economic Development Corporation, so extremely rural. And I think we have so piggybacking on that, we have families that are going to be looking at the fall, but up here and in other rural areas, we have another layer to that problem, which is connectivity is an issue for a lot of our families. So the children who are supposed to be remote learning are not able to connect themselves. So we've been thinking about what that looks like going forward and how we can solve that problem pretty quickly, because that is going to be an issue. Part of that perception problem too is, identifying IT as an area of true opportunity. Again, coupled with the fact that IT and technology in some places in our rural communities, we don't have connectivity. That is a recruiting of business problems. So we have plenty of IT jobs that are inside of our banking institutions, inside of our medical institutions, but the schools are not necessarily picking up on that, and some of them are reticent to create IT areas of learning for the high schools. So that's something that we've been working on. And so I think that's something to think about. And we have businesses that would love to expand usage of training mechanisms, but again, they feel like their ability to pay for that is the issue. So, any more assistance for businesses that are interested in hiring, but right, in some situations, the cost of putting a journeyman through school still falls on their side. Is there a way to create something inside of that? And I know there's programs for that, but because they're competitive, maybe expanding that even further.
Thanks, Kenan, and thanks, Jim and Paul, for pulling this together. I think the intellectual level of the conversation is tremendous. Really, two observations in our workforce-related conversation we're having. One is that there are many jobs that require a physical presence. Clearly, for example, a restaurant. But there's a whole host of jobs that I think employers prior to COVID believed or wanted to believe required a physical presence. But now during COVID, employers are, in many cases, realizing, well, perhaps the physical presence at the employment location is not necessarily required. So what I think we're going to see, not just in Wisconsin, but everywhere, that the pool of potential candidates for positions previously thought to require a physical presence, but now after COVID, we realize don't, the pool of candidates is going to be everywhere, which kind of leads us to investigate, well, if people can be anywhere, then is it really the employer that we're trying to lure and grab and hang on to here? Or do we want to create attractive places for our citizens to be so they can live in Wisconsin and work in San Diego? And that's one thing I think that start of a trend we're likely to see. Second, unrelated, related to workforce, but really education. Our structure has put education and the workforce desires or employment community at odds. And here's what I mean. The current structure, the legislature might say, well, higher education, you should produce more of this kind of person with this kind of intellect and education, because that's what society needs. That's sort of the what is best for society and our workforce sort of mindset. Yet we underfund higher education. So we force higher education into a supply-demand model. In other words, if I'm the UW system, I say, gee, there's a lot of engineers that are needed. Well, increase the demand, I can charge more to create the supply. So we increase the price of that because I need the dollars as a system because I'm not getting it from anywhere else. Yet what we ought to be doing is saying society needs more engineers. Hey, as higher education, let's lower that price and get more people educated in engineering to get them into the workforce to fuel our economy. So that's an education workforce structural challenge that I think we have. That in my opinion, on that item, that is relatively easily solved, especially if we create a revenue stream where we're putting more dollars into government coffers, which we can then take, invest in our higher education system to produce what society needs. At the same time, invest in our communities to make them attractive places for people to be, so they can fuel the workforce from the remote location that they can work at in the future.
This is fascinating, folks. I find it very, very helpful. I want to ask, we'll be talking in a minute about part of what we're doing with this digital platform. But one of the reasons we wanted to do sessions like this was to identify issues that would give decision makers, policy makers, and others around the state an opportunity to think creatively about what do we do at this moment in time. There are clearly needs, et cetera. So that issue's been out there for some time for us. And as we've gone around the state, we've asked leaders to sit down and interview around questions about what's working in your district, what are you doing different in your corporation, et cetera. The consistent drumbeat that comes out of all of this over the last year that we were doing this is the focus on collaboration, that the relationship between the public sector and the private sector has become more dynamic and more necessary. And those are the kinds of things you're talking about. I will come in the remaining moments as we move close to the end of our hour. I want to ask each of you whether or not you're willing to help us structure a smaller conversation around an issue. So perhaps Julie and Brittany would like to talk about that virtual relationship. Who else should we have in there so that we can have a 10 or 15 minute conversation that would help decision makers understand that option? Or maybe it's Barb and Jean talking about education, or maybe it's Dan and Brittany and Barb talking about the rural economy. So there are ways to put people together that we begin to inform the conversation as policymakers and decision makers in the public and private sector can showcase the kinds of things that are going on, the kinds of options that we ought to be focusing on. Let me ask and put Ben Miller and Patty and maybe Mark, that part of the go forward here is clearly redesigning everybody's business plan, okay? Do you bring the students back in? Do you not bring them in? Are you doing it virtually? Are you doing it in some other fashion? And yet we want this collaboration thing. What are you seeing out there now? I know you've all got programs in place. I guess I'm asking you to look a little bit into the future and talk about what do you see happening on the campuses? What do you see changing in the relationship with employers? And let me put a finer point on it. If I'm trying to get employers to engage in a robust recruitment program, and they know that the skill sets are going to be changing and that we're going to be living in an age of change for the next at least 2 to 5 years. What do they need? What do they need from a flexibility point of view? What do they need from a focus point of view? What do they need from a cost point of view? And what are the campuses and the schools talking about around those sorts of issues?
So Jim, a couple of reactions. Number one, maybe back to the previous conversation. I think an area of collaboration and opportunity for Wisconsin, public and private, might very well be the non-resident student who comes to the University of Wisconsin-Madison from, all over the world. How do we as a state together keep that student here in Wisconsin for a very fulfilling life and job and career? I'm looking at some data here that we know. We just did a report through Equifax, using Equifax data, that somewhere between 15 and 20% of our a student who starts as a non-resident, 5 years out, somewhere between 15 and 20% are staying in Wisconsin. One area of focus might very well be, how do we move that number up to something that's more respectable? Our resident student numbers are fine, right? It's almost like 90% of our resident students who start at a UW Systems campus after they graduate 5 years out, 9 out of 10 are still in Wisconsin, and most of them are gainfully employed. So as you identify opportunities for collaboration, both across the system and across our educational systems, not just UW system, but the tech colleges as well, and private industry, are there models or examples or incentives that we can work on that would help us as a state keep the talent that's coming here for their educational degree?
So Ben, can I ask a question? Obviously, the UW-Madison has a unique relationship with the international community, and I wouldn't want to mess with that in any way, shape, or form per se. On the other hand, when we look at the data that says you want to up the percentage of those who stay in the state after their 4-year or 5-year education, proximity to the state is one of those issues. So where do they come from? Okay, and so the numbers we believe go up if you're recruiting from Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Ohio. Okay? But in order to be able to do that, we need to start recruiting down in the high school, at the high school level, in order to bring those people in here and trade some cost benefit in their education. I don't think that's a huge deal given the current pricing, but to be able to bring them in and say we can offset a variety of other kinds of costs. And I know that some of the campuses are engaged in that. And so, I mean, do you see that as a piece of the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we've been talking with a couple of major employers in the state who might be interested in offering some sort of loan or grant or program to offer students who might come in and then agree to take on a job, at that company upon graduation. The other thing I got to point out is, you asked about what our relationship with companies. We have found that we've got to do more than just a career fair, right? The kid who grew up in upstate New York, who comes to Wisconsin for an education, has no idea, or may have never heard of companies like Kohler, Johnson Control, big Wisconsin firms that have brand awareness and appreciation for us Wisconsinites. But for that New Yorker, there just is no appreciation or understanding of who they are. They may not be located in Madison. You're located in Stevens Point. You might as well be, located in California for these students. And so we're trying to do more sustained, ongoing, more frequent activities with companies, guest lectures, other ways that they can build a brand and build an awareness for our students. Again, helping to maybe create an opportunity for them to stay upon graduation.
Great, thanks. Patty, want to jump in there?
There's a few things I wanted to say throughout this whole discussion, so I'm going to try to keep them together. We're in fire right now, right? So we're trying to deal with the situation we're in with COVID. We're trying to plan for the future. We're trying to talk to companies about where they see things going and how COVID has changed the way they work, and how will that change the skill sets that their employees need to have so that we're actually preparing them correctly. We're doing that all with limited funding, fewer students, so we have lower tuition, in a box in terms of our tax revenue. So the funding situation for us is a struggle as we try to do and solve all of the problems we have to solve. I wanted to just make sure I supported Brittany in terms of the rural broadband. So I oversee 5 campuses, all of them in rural areas. And companies like CenturyLink aren't interested in funding broadband out to those areas without businesses that need it. So that the conversation around why do we recruit businesses to rural areas? It's frankly to get broadband and other services in place. Otherwise, we're not going to get them, and we have to figure out how to solve that problem in order to continue education moving forward. So I think we need to collaborate. We have a lot of private-public partnerships, especially at Western and a lot of the things that we do. But we have to sort of solve the fire we're going through right now, and at the same time plan for the future. And I think ongoing discussions need to happen if we're going to affect any change in any of those areas we've discussed.
Yeah, I know one of your goals today, Jim, is to solicit volunteers to move forward with the discussion. And I've been jotting down here. It seems like we have multiple discussions going on. We're talking about short-term workforce solutions versus long-term. And by short-term, I mean, what are we going to do this fall semester when school starts up, as Julie was pointing out. We have a discussion on upskilling existing employees or residents versus recruiting from out of state. And I'll slide Ben's comment, it's kind of midway in there. We have so many students that come to Wisconsin, go to the UW system, and we don't hold on to them. So they're a part of the recruiting from out of state, but getting them while they're here. We have now the on-site model in terms of employers, and the old model, we'll call it, where all employees came to a common site. Now we're seeing that a number of those can do that work off-site. So that's another discussion. And then that ties into Brittany's comments regarding broadband. If we have more people working off-site, we're going to have to increase our broadband access statewide. And then the last thing in terms of education is the need to upskill employees across the state versus post-secondary education's challenges now in a COVID-19 era. So we have really multiple discussions going on here, and I just want to throw this out because if any one of those is of interest, I think Jim has a home for you as far as future CWI discussions. So I thought I'd just throw that out.
Thank you, Gene. That's a perfect lead in to, Ken, can you play the brief video here in terms of where we're going here? We get to this point, and what I will tell you is the next step for us is we have a series of things that we need to do. We need to raise public awareness. We need to strengthen public-private collaborations. We need to build consensus around the need to energize and fund more competition, more competitive recruitment and retention efforts. Our goal in this process is to be able for a legislator or a news media person or anybody else to click on any one of the counties you see on that state map and hear an employer talk about what's going on. Hear somebody from the economic development community talk about what's going on. Talk about what we agree on. Talk about how we need to move forward. We will get to you these videotapes, these interviews. There will be a digital platform that will be updated on a regular basis where you can hear conversations and find out what other folks are doing. So right now, you're here for legislative exchange. The realtors are having government days. The network or the co-op network had government days. A year from now, I want all of those organizations to have this set of issues on your agenda. Our belief is that we need to build consensus and collaboration out around the state, out around the communities, around this issue, and do a legislative exchange at Government Day on the issue of workforce recruitment and retention and why something needs to happen now. Let me just add a couple of words. Come January, regardless of what happens in the electoral cycles across the nation and here in Wisconsin, there is not a single state legislature that isn't going to be assaulted with requests for funding, that isn't going to be scrambling to try to figure out how to reallocate the funds that they do have and how to adjust forward. What we have here, we believe, is an issue and a body of data in which we get to say to the legislators and the taxpayers and the media and to you folks, hopefully, that we're not asking for money. We're talking about ways to generate new money. and that if Wisconsin does not address that, it'll only get worse. So the issue is not whether or not it will be politically viable. It's viable because we're not asking for money, and because it becomes viable. It's viable because we're not asking for money, and because it's an issue that lots and lots and lots of people are affected by. What we need to do, however, as I mentioned in that video, is we need to build a sense of understanding and consensus around this. And you folks are critical to that. And so that's kind of the next step for us. We are, as Jane noted and Paul noted, we are doing these around the state, and intend to do as many as we can. And then, in effort to build this idea that associations and trade groups, et cetera, all ought to put workforce recruitment and retention on their legislative agendas, and we've talked to a number of them. And I think that there is growing interest in doing that. But we then need to demonstrate local support and regional support. So we will be going to county boards with resolutions. We do want to go to chambers of commerce and ask for support. And we do want to ask you folks, you've got associations, you've got organizations, give us a hand there. But the most immediate thing is to continue these conversations, to continue to populate this digital worksite. The CWI board needs a chance to sign off on it, but we'll be sending you a link to that website probably no later than the 15th of July.
Jim, Kenyon, thank you for pulling this together. What this conversation today underscores for me, and I think for WDC, is that, and Barb talked about looking through that report. If you haven't looked at the report that we published late last night, it talks about so many of the things, Jim, that have been highlighted in this conversation, whether it's an investment in broadband as one of the key things we have to do, whether it's an investment in our tech schools and our UW system. We've heard that our enrollment at both in the last couple of months are up, and that's typically what happens when we follow the market into a recession like this. And so this has been a great collection of voices. A lot of the voices here today helped contribute to that report, and a lot of the ideas here mirror what's in that report. So we'll certainly be working in line with a lot of the ideas that have been shared today. So thanks.
Yeah, I know that we're all pressed for time. I put my comment in the chats too, but as we are trying to figure out our way forward during COVID-19, it's become abundantly clear that a lot of our counties don't have county level administrators, nor do we have city administrators in some places, and a lot of towns don't have administrators. It creates this lack of forward vision, and trying to figure out how to change that structure will really help having additional bodies and minds across the whole entire state. So that's a structural change as well.
Thank you. Well, it is coming up on 9:57, and it's been my experience in my long life that if you start meetings and stop meetings when you said you were going to, the odds that people will come back goes up. So I am going to say thank you very, very much to everybody on here. We will be reaching out to you to get you the link to the digital platform, but also to encourage you to think about who you would be interested in, what kind of an issue you would focus a conversation on, and who you think we should invite to be a part of that conversation so that we can pursue that a little further. Gene, I think you already offered good comments, but if you would like to offer a close, that's fine. Let me just give anybody else who has one last burning thing they need to say or want to say. If not, I will simply say thank you very, very much. I appreciate it, and we'll be back in touch. Gene?
Yeah, and on behalf of Paul and the rest of us here at MadREP, thanks all for tuning in this morning. This is such a multifaceted discussion, but obviously it's going to take all of us to start forging solutions for the betterment of the state. But again, thank you for tuning in, and more to come.